Time for us to start. Welcome, everybody. It's a real pleasure for me to be able to introduce Jessica Lovering. And I know her from back when she was at the Breakthrough Institute and was starting to work on nuclear energy related topics and wrote the report, How to Make Nuclear Cheap, which identified probably the single most important thing that needs to be done for nuclear to play a large-scale role in the future. So she is the co-founder and executive director of the Good Energy Collective, a new organization building the progressive cause for nuclear energy as an essential part of the broader climate change agenda and working to align the clean energy space with environmental justice and sustainability goals. She completed her PhD in engineering and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University. Her dissertation focused on how commercial nuclear trade affects international security standards and how very small nuclear reactors could be deployed at the community level. These are all things that we're obviously interested in as well. She is a fellow with the Energy for Growth Hub, looking at how advanced nuclear can be deployed in sub-Saharan Africa, and a senior visiting fellow with the Fastest Path to Zero initiative at the University of Michigan. And with that introduction, I want to turn things over to Jessica. Coal to nuclear repowering.
Thank you. Thank you, Farron. One thing Farron didn't mention is that I am a UC Berkeley alum. I did my undergrad here, so always good to be back. I do have a somewhat of a physics background, but that was a long time ago. I've been working mostly on the policy side since 2012. And I'm more in the think tank space now. I have a couple caveats. So Good Energy Collective is a progressive think tank. We work on nuclear energy policy, more at the community level. And so we're really interested in this intersection between advancing nuclear energy and environmental justice. So something that's going to be a little bit different about my talk is that I'm not going to be so much focused on the work I've done, although I do have a couple slides on that, but more just kind of a state of play of what's happening in the space around coal to nuclear, some ways that you can get more involved if you're interested, or kind of further reading you can do if you're interested in the topic. I will touch on some of the work that we're doing. I know for those of you, still students, still in academia, what are think tanks? What do they do? We can talk about that a little bit more after in the Q&A as well. Okay, so our interest in coal closure communities. So from 2010 to 2020, about 600 coal plants closed in the US, which is about 100 gigawatts. And if that number seems small, most of these coal plants that closed were older, so they tended to be on the smaller side. In the next 10 years, we're probably going to see another 25 gigawatts close. Those are going to be bigger plants. And while these closures are really great from an environmental perspective, from a carbon emissions perspective, it can be really devastating for the host communities that have these facilities. They've had coal power plants or coal mines in their communities for often over 100 years. So it's very ingrained in their economies and their workforce. So there was a really good study by the Union of Concerned Scientists and the Utility Workers Union of America, which is one of the big labor unions for coal power plant workers, looking at what it would cost to transition these communities away from coal. And they estimated it would be about $30 to $83 billion to provide kind of a comprehensive set of supports. So things like pensions, healthcare, re-education, to the roughly 90,000 people that are directly employed in the U.S. coal industry. That doesn't account for all the secondary employment and secondary economic impacts in these communities. So 90,000 people, not a ton. Primary employment might seem small, but these communities and these regions are really dependent on coal in a lot of cases. And we've seen this just in the last kind of 5 to 10 years with backlash, even though so far a lot of these closures from coal plants are really due to cheap natural gas prices and the transition from coal to gas. There's been a lot of political pushback and sort of this war on coal, especially in these regions, kind of creating some backlash against clean energy and climate action. So that's really concerning, and thinking about how we can mitigate that going forward as we're trying to completely phase out fossil fuels. So this is where the idea of a just transition comes in. And the term just transition was really developed by labor unions and by the labor movement, starting in the 70s around this big globalization and movement of manufacturing jobs out of the US, and thinking about if we're losing manufacturing jobs, or as the economy is transitioning, how do you ensure sort of continuity and sustainable employment for that workforce? And it's challenging. So I think in the last 10 to 20 years, we've seen a lot of rhetoric and focus on green jobs, and this idea that, you know, the clean energy economy will provide lots of new jobs, and that is true, and you're seeing that with the Inflation Reduction Act. But there's a lot of challenges in that, and a lot of kind of sense of false promise and some betrayal in these fossil-dependent communities. So a big one is mismatch in job location. Where we're building renewables or EV plants or battery plants is not necessarily where all those fossil fuel jobs work. Mismatch in skills. So the skills of mining coal are very different than installing solar panels or doing battery chemistry. There's often, depends on the industry, of course, reduced pay, benefits, or ability to join a union. So we can talk about the, you know, lots of politics around unions right now, but the utility industry is heavily unionized, and coal has a very long history of union involvement in terms of maintaining those high salaries and those good benefits. So that's something where when a coal facility closes, it's not just a job, it's also really good benefits, a pension, that you probably don't have access to in a new industry. There's been a lot of policies going back to the Obama administration of trying to source new energy jobs in these regions, and they've been pretty kind of piecemeal, and some successes and some sort of stagnation. So there's been interest for a long time, but really it's picked up as the Biden administration came in, of a focus on coal to nuclear repowering. And could this facilitate a just transition, both for workers and for communities that host coal facilities? So first I wanted to start with a couple definitions, because I'm not an engineer, so I use the term repowering pretty loosely, but there are very specific definitions of repowering. So the first term, which I think a lot of power systems engineers think of repowering as what we call full repowering. And so that's where you're basically swapping out the coal boiler, which generates the steam, with a small modular reactor. And you're having full reuse of everything. Steam cycle, condenser cooling system, your grid connection, and of course all the auxiliary buildings on the site. For this, your coal plant pretty much needs to be brand new, so built sort of in the last 5 years. The US doesn't have a lot of those coal plants, so that's why it's not so much a focus in the US, but in East Asia, South Asia, this is much more attractive, and even Eastern Europe has some brand new coal plants that this could work with. Partial repowering, that's maybe a coal plant, or this could work for a coal plant that was built within 10 or 15 years, even up to 20 years. There, you're going to need a new steam cycle, but you could still reuse that condenser cooling system and, of course, the grid connection and the rest of the buildings. The last one, site repurposing. This is for older coal plants, coal plants that are maybe shutting down or closing, retiring. This is mostly what we have in the US. Here, it's mostly thinking about using a brownfield site. So you can still make use of the grid connection, which is actually quite valuable, and other infrastructure like cooling water rights, transportation infrastructure, rail, road, water access, like ports. So that's mostly what I'm going to be talking about, but I'll point you to some studies at the end that look more at full repowering and partial repowering. So there's some big benefits to coal to nuclear repowering specifically. So benefits for communities: nuclear power plants employ more people at higher salaries, and they're highly unionized in comparison to coal plants. There's similar unionization to coal plants, but in comparison to, say, repowering with natural gas employs far fewer people than a coal power plant, and it's typically non-union. Jobs stay local and long-term, which is different than other types of economic redevelopment, which might look at, transitioning people to solar or wind. It's sort of, you can maybe keep jobs in the region, but this is using the same facilities. So, the same commuter paths, the same housing, there's actually, for a lot of the positions, minimal retraining needed. For the most part, generating electricity at a coal plant and a nuclear plant is very similar. I'll show you a more detailed chart on that next. And then importantly for the community, similar tax revenue. There's also benefits for nuclear developers, so the project developers. Make use of existing infrastructure. This can reduce your capital costs for the project. And I think the most important one that we're seeing interest in is local workforce with very relevant experience. As we're trying to scale up this new industry, where do you get the workforce and people with those skill sets? Yeah.
So is the tax revenue very different for gas power plants?
Yes. It depends on the number of people that are there and the kind of permanent workforce in terms of tax benefits, and the amount of money that goes into the capital infrastructure. So typically you see pretty high tax revenue for a nuclear power plant just because it's such a big facility. I don't know why that has to be the case, but I think a lot of it is that there's just a lot fewer people employed in a natural gas plant. And then the capital cost is much less for a gas plant. I don't know why that affects tax revenue, but it does. So.
Sure, property tax.
There, yeah, okay.
So it's a local tax.
Yes.
It's a tax to the thing.
Yeah. And you hear this when nuclear power plants are looking to close. The local school district always comes to the meetings because the schools are almost entirely funded by property tax revenue at the local level. So, okay, this is from a report that NewScale did looking at specifically the workforce issue around coal to nuclear. And they separated out the number of positions at a power plant. I believe this is for a 12-unit plant, but the number of jobs and the education level and how it could be sort of transferred. And what they found is a lot of their positions could be minimal retraining, something like a night course for retraining poll workers. Okay, so my organization, Good Energy Collective, we wanted to do an analysis of where these types of projects might be most feasible, most attractive in the short term. So sort of the first demonstrations. So we did a geospatial analysis of coal plants in the US and sort of picked out the best sites that we thought and some policy recommendations. So this is, you can tell I'm no longer an academic. I'm going to have one slide on my methodology and one slide on our results, and then that's it. We're going to move on. So we took, I work a lot with the Fastest Path to Zero initiative, which is at the University of Michigan in their nuclear engineering department. They helped us develop a database of 304 coal plants that retired since 2010 or will retire before 2045. Because these projects might take a while to develop, so we wanted a long timeline. We filtered out states, coal plants that are in states that had policy restrictions against new nuclear plants. You might still want to do a project there in the long term, but in the short term, why make it harder? So we also looked for states that have incentives or benefits at the state level for new nuclear, like they include them in their renewable portfolio standard, things like that. And then we tried to be broad here, but we did have a range of sizes. So something, bigger than 300 megawatts and less than 1,000 megawatts is a good fit for an SMR. And then we also filtered out coal plants that were in safety hazard zones, as identified for NRC guidelines. Now, a lot of these coal plants are really old, so they might be in places where now we wouldn't build a power plant there. So something on a really steep grade, something in a flood zone, something in an earthquake zone. So again, just trying to make it easier for siting that nuclear power plant.
How many coal plants did you find with more than 1,000 megawatts unit size? I can't think, you know, especially.
Not
the
unit
ones-
size, but power plant size, and that's, you know.
Okay, yeah, the units, okay, yeah.
Capacity, what did we say? Capacity per unit, yeah, there weren't a lot, definitely not per unit. But we also didn't, just to clarify here, so we one thing we're interested in is optimizing for the existing transmission lines. So if the power plant itself, the whole power plant is greater than 1,000 megawatts, you probably wouldn't wanna build a nuclear plant that was much smaller than that, because you want to take advantage of the full transmission capability. So we're trying to match kind of the capacity size 1-to-1 as best we could. We think those projects would be most attractive. So this was our main result. We found about 80 plants that we thought were kind of the most attractive, most feasible for first cases. And what's interesting is they're spread out across the US. So the number on the state is the number of coal plants we thought were good fits for coal to nuclear repowering. And then the colors, the green is, the state has a policy to support new nuclear in some way. And yellow are states that have restrictions on nuclear, including our home here, California. So it's optimistic for me, at least, that they're spread out across the US. This isn't just an Appalachia issue or a Southeast issue. It's kind of everywhere. And there's some interesting overlap with states that have support for new nuclear that maybe, you know, don't have nuclear now, like Colorado, New Mexico, and Nevada, that might be interesting, or North Carolina. So that's something that has got people thinking about maybe new ways or new places for nuclear that don't currently. Yeah.
The plant that's gonna go in at Kemmerer, is that one of the two
No.
that's in there? It's not, there's two more. There's two
Yeah,
more.
so we can talk about that. We also we got a lot of flack that we don't have any in West Virginia, and it's because they, at the time, they had restrictions on new nuclear, they don't anymore. There's also pretty much all the coal plants in West Virginia are on very steep grades. And so West Virginia is very interested in doing SMRs, but just, you know, the filter we used of the NRC's grade guidelines knocked out. That's not to say you can do it, but yeah, so I see, and again,
That's fine, right?
Yeah.
When you say restrictions on new nuclear, is it onerous regulation or like complete showstopper? Like,
it's different by state. So some of them, like West Virginia's was the legislature had to vote on a new nuclear plant. So that's not a showstopper, but for our thinking was from a developer's perspective, if you're gonna go and state that you have to get, you know, 2/3 of the legislature to approve your plant versus a state where you can just work with the regulator and cite it. For first demonstrations, that's kind of what we were thinking.
for some waste restriction to it.
And for why there's so few in Wyoming, the issue is that.
And Montana too, that's the other one where there was strong political support, but is it just the demand too small?
The closure dates weren't announced. This is
Okay.
we really should redo the announcement with all coal plants. We were just looking at ones that had announced
Because
closures.
I know the Sheridan plant in Wyoming has talked about it, they talked about citing some of your small
Yeah.
reactors there, so it just seems like an interesting one to get on there for
Yeah.
political and for some demand.
Yeah, I'm gonna talk more about what's going on in Wyoming now.
Okay.
So some recommendations that we had, both for the SMR vendors and for these coal closure communities, for both of them, it's start early. I know for some of these coal plants are not retiring for 10, 15, 20 years, but it can take a while to develop a nuclear power project. For the SMR vendors, you know, early engagement with the NRC, but also early engagement with utility, municipality, or the owner of the coal plant. And then something we think is really important is identifying local technical or community colleges that can help develop curriculum for that worker retraining, or other community workforce organizations. A lot of states, but also counties or regional groups of counties have economic development associations. They're actually doing a lot of work right now on feasibility of new nuclear. So coming into this, I did not know that was a thing, but in terms of municipal government, there is already a lot of work at the community level and looking at new industries and sort of what's needed. So trying to find those organizations that are already thinking about transitioning the workforce and how you can get more resources to them. Yeah, so these economic development groups. For the coal closure communities, working with their local utility to see what the utility is thinking about for the coal plant. And then exploring just how to get more resources to your community for worker retraining. It's hard, you know, if you don't know the industry that's coming to your community, you don't know what you need to retrain for. So finding ways to partner with the SMR vendor to kind of, you know, cost share on that retraining, or just have the vendor fund it outright. You can ask for that. So those are some of the things we recommend. So there are a couple early examples of coal repowering projects that are going on now, or, you know, they're not starting construction yet, but they're moving through all these early stages. So the one that a lot of people don't think of is coal repowering, and it's not quite, you know, direct repowering, but NuScale's project in Idaho, deploying the first modules for UAMPS, which is an association of municipal utilities. They have been working through licensing, but something that's important from the utilities perspective, the reason that UAMPS chose NuScale is they had coal plants that were closing. They needed to replace that power, and they were looking for something that was low carbon, not because they currently had regulations or constraints on carbon emissions, but they saw, or they felt that they would in the future, and they were trying to hedge against future regulation on carbon. That's why they chose NuScale, or that's why they chose nuclear. They have this very interesting community opt-in model. So NuScale has been a really challenging project working with UAMPS because it's a collection of 20 plus municipal utilities, and they have to get buy-in from all those utilities. They have to get opt-in. And so that's a lot of partners to engage with, a lot of people you need to convince. And so it's been hard for them, but we argue, others argue, that it builds a more sustainable project in the long term if you do get buy-in from all those groups, because you had to earn that trust and that buy-in. And so they've had points where, you know, their estimated cost increases, and they had to go to all these utilities and say, our cost is 10% higher, 20% higher than we initially quoted you. Do you still want to be a partner in this project? And so far, most of them have said yes. They're provided with off-ramps so that they can exit the project. They have had some utilities exit, but they've also brought in new partners, new buyers of the electricity. So these non-UAMPS members can also participate. So it's been a struggle. I think it's worth it in the long term for them, but we'll see. But this is a model, and it's also, I think, interesting for us. Utah doesn't currently have any nuclear generation. A collection of small municipal utilities, very different than the large utilities that operate nuclear today. The other one, which we kind of hinted at, is TerraPower's Natrium project in Wyoming. So TerraPower announced that they were interested in Wyoming. They were considering 4 towns. But they selected and said we're interested, and they worked with all of those communities to kind of do feasibility studies, look at economic plans, and they selected one site in Kemmer, was chosen, and then since then they've announced that they're looking to do up to 4 additional projects. So I know you're mostly nuclear people in here, so I won't go into too much details, but sodium fast reactor with storage, agreement with PacifiCorp to operate the plant, and they're looking first to power. I think that's pushed back a little bit, but after 2028, and interesting for the local community, it's 2,000 construction jobs, but 250 operating jobs. And what's interesting, so this town, Camera, has a coal plant, and actually most of these towns have coal plants that have closed or are closing soon. So this is still even loosely in the site repurposing, because it's not at the exact site, it's nearby, but they are using some of the existing infrastructure and definitely the workforce. But we haven't yet seen kind of this direct site use, that we think is gonna be of more interest going forward.
You know, if the nuclear and storage team will be fully integrated, or are these gonna be two separate jobs and team flows? Because that is an attractive feature of this for a lot of emerging economies who need both, variety.
I mean,
Especially if they're gonna do it time
Yeah,
use.
they're quite integrated in the plant design, so I don't know on the team side.
Because it would be a new expertise area to add to some of the nuclear engineers,
Yes.
and the storage world, which is very active. Morocco, China, India, doesn't have a nuclear at all, so there's an interesting other angle here that we're getting.
I'm sorry, what is it, your story?
Molten salt, thermal,
Oh,
restoring, thermal storage.
storing heat.
Yeah, so they're using it for peaker capabilities.
Oh, okay.
So I don't know the exact, I'm trying to remember the exact megawatts if anyone knows, but it's, they operate at base load at, I'm gonna make up numbers, 400 megawatts, and they can peak up to 500, 600
I see.
for short periods of time.
At least India, I know Gujarat is talking about this as well, so that there can be some industrial customers that can tie it in. So there's some benefits for location, for plant locations.
Yeah, and the next example I'll show, so X Energy is partnered with the Maryland Energy Administration, which is the DOE at the state level, is looking at a feasibility study of repurposing coal fire with an SMR. That's more of this direct repurposing. But X Energy is also, their first demonstration is gonna be at a Dow chemical site in Texas, so they're gonna be using that industrial heat. So they may be more kind of set up for that dual purpose use. Okay, there's a lot more utilities that are just sort of thinking about these types of projects. Right now, a lot of states are kind of know they need to do something about phasing out fossil fuels, and they're just figuring out where they are. Even California, who has this state mandate to get to 100% clean electricity, is still figuring out what they're gonna do. But some examples, so Duke Energy released integrated resource plan for North and South Carolina that they serve, that are trying to phase out coal by 2035, and nuclear share is gonna grow to 70% of electricity. So they don't say anything about coal to nuclear repowering, but if they're closing a bunch of coal and building a bunch of nuclear, it makes sense. Dominion has expressed interest in building nuclear in Virginia to replace retiring coal plants. The Salt River Project, which is a nonprofit in Arizona, is looking very specifically at repowering the Coronado generating station in Arizona with nuclear. The Gateway for Accelerated Innovation Nuclear, which is a program run out of Idaho National Labs, they helped with the feasibility study at Coronado, if you want to read more about that. And then TVA, which is a federally owned utility, plans to phase out coal by 2035, and they already operate nuclear power plants, so they're looking at expanding their nuclear as well. Okay, there's a lot of new policies at the federal and state level, some specific for coal to nuclear repowering, but mostly more for new nuclear and some for helping coal communities. So there's a lot at the intersection. The big one is the Inflation Reduction Act has technology neutral production tax credits and ETC, investment tax credits, sorry, that should be ITC, for clean energy, but they have a bunch of bonus tax credits. So you can get sort of more money back for different things, like using prevailing wages. And one of the things you can get a bonus tax credit for is locating in an energy community, and that includes coal closure communities, natural gas. There's also a separate program that helps build in nuclear sites like national labs or places that were part of the weapons complex. CHIPS and Science Act has $800 million specifically to develop advanced nuclear and coal communities. This is more like feasibility studies, project development. Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act had feasibility studies for microreactors in isolated communities. That's more diesel replacement, but, and then DOE's Loan Program Office could also help fund some of these new nuclear projects. At the state level, we've actually seen a lot happening with nuclear. So Wyoming, you know, they have that TerraPower project. They've been passing a lot of state legislation for feasibility studies, supportive laws, helping understanding the licensing context. Maryland had a feasibility study, Nebraska feasibility, Hawaii doesn't want it, doesn't mention anything with nuclear, but they are trying to get off coal, and it's difficult for them to do that, being islanded. Alaska is really interested in new nuclear, and they had some legislation around permitting requirements. Virginia has passed a bunch of legislation around nuclear hubs, innovation hubs, consortia, and feasibility studies. Kentucky has a nuclear development working group at the state level, and then Tennessee, the governor enacted a council to promote nuclear, which is interesting development. So there's a lot of diversity in what states are doing, but there's a lot of interest in nuclear, particularly to take advantage of all the money that's in the Inflation Reduction Act. And then of course, there's a huge international market. So the US has a lot of coal plants, but our coal plants tend to be quite old. So outside of the US, there's even more coal. And this is some work that I helped with that was done between Energy for Growth Hub and Third Way, two think tanks in DC. And this map, this is actually an interactive tool that you can go and play with. But what we did is we projected growth in electricity demand for every country out to 2030 and 2050. And we included a certain amount of coal repowering, just with how much electricity demand is there if you assume a certain number of coal plants are closing, but also a certain amount of vehicle electrification. But we also, the big bulk here is just projecting out electricity demand based on population and income growth. And then we went through every country and categorized them by how ready they were for nuclear, based on a set of 12 checklist of infrastructure capabilities, things like have they put out a tender for a nuclear project. And so that's the color of the bubble, and the size of the bubble is new demand for electricity by 2050. So the big result here is that there is growth in demand for nuclear of about, trying to remember, 300%. It's quite large. About 80% of it is in places that are already ready for nuclear. So they have nuclear, or they are taking bids, they have projects under construction. So might not be a good fit for everyone, but there is huge growth in the market there, particularly if you look at coal repowering as well. Yeah.
Recently, the New York Times had this great article about where the workforce and economic activity would be through 2050 or 2060. And it strikes me that a lot of the places that you've got on this map also had that going on, which would, I think, support this.
Yeah.
As even further. In your analysis of this, trying to look at the market, are you looking at population growth rates?
Yes.
That go into this?
Yeah, so we use population growth rates and then also income growth rates, because for the most part, especially at lower levels of energy consumption, electricity demand is very correlated with. There's also, separate question, but something you might be interested in here. There's huge supply of engineers coming from a lot of these places that have high growth and demand. So, very exciting opportunities.
So I can't see exactly what countries I'm looking at here, because it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard to tell from the map.
Well,
but
go play with the interactive. You can,
India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh in particular really stuck out as being areas which.
I've been a little bit connected with the Kenya nuclear development, and what they were doing very well until they got hit with a tremendous amount of basically a money bomb for wind development in the way north
Let's do the
northwest,
neat.
Like,
That's-
Sorry.
way northwest part of, where there are no canyons. And they basically, could get the windmills for nothing. The problem is that they couldn't afford to have the electricity down to the south of Kenya, which is where the people were. But what it did though, was it totally took the wind out of the sails of the nuclear program.
well, so take it up with Dan. I'm definitely of the opinion of we need more of everything, and it's not a competition between renewables and nuclear. So, I think nuclear for a lot of these countries is gonna be a bit of more of a long term, and, at least at current penetration levels, nuclear and wind are, not nuclear, solar and wind are very cheap right now, so, I think of them, Dan and I can disagree, but, at least at this level, thinking of, wind and solar as fuel savers. You know, they're great at cutting down fossil fuel use. But for long term, you know, I think there's still a role to play, even if it's, you know, just 10% of the grid is nuclear in 2050, you know, we still need to be, getting that process started now.
And Kenya is a really great site for a small reactor for a whole bunch of reasons.
Oh, yeah.
So I think they just got this first build certification thing from the IEA. I mean, there's a lot of,
Groundwork also?
yeah, it would be.
And, just to kind of aid this argument, NuScale had this really good study looking at how SMRs could help facilitate growth in wind, and how they can, you know, work together to get
Yeah.
deeper penetration of low carbon energy, so, yes. If you have limited funds, you know, there is some trade-off in what you can invest in, but, something we've seen, and this is, Europe gets mad at the US about Inflation Reduction Act, but you could also just invest money in everything. That has benefits too. For long term, we're definitely gonna need diversity because we don't know what's gonna work. So if you're interested in what other countries' opportunity is, or where they are in terms of readiness for new nuclear, check out this tool. Just some ongoing work that Good Energy is doing. What we're doing in the coal repowering space is, so we're mostly not focused on the technical side. So we're doing community engagement with potential communities that might be interested in coal repowering, figuring out kind of what they need, what their concerns are, what resources, what types of investments, what sorts of policies they would need. Not coal to nuclear, but we just got a very big DOE award for consent-based siting of interim waste storage. That's waste, but the actual work we're doing looks very similar to the community engagement we're doing for new nuclear power plants. So we're gonna be learning a lot in terms of how to engage with siting, you know, challenging facilities. Some other just recent work we're doing, we do all sorts of things on nuclear, so this report on the left is kind of intersection of environmental justice issues with nuclear, so all the challenges in nuclear's history and present, and some policy solutions for some of them. There's some work on sustainable and ethical uranium mining, and then might be of interest to folks. This is a California specific case study on the equity implications of clean energy policies. California has a lot of different clean energy policies, and some of them are regressive, some of them are progressive, and yeah, it's a mess. So I think California is a good test lab for the rest of the country. I'm from California, so I can say that. Yeah, and a little bit more technical, I just wanted to point out one of your alums, Stefan Fisk. He has published a lot of studies more on the technical side of direct repowering. So if you're interested more in the engineering aspects, just go put his name into Google Scholar and there's a bunch of studies. He has done a lot of work in Poland and sort of the cost savings of direct repowering. So yeah. Yes, so that's it. I've got some time for questions and yeah.
Thank you very much for the talk. I thought it was great that you mentioned that utilities weren't that particularly sensitive to cost, and also that there was if the cost, okay, I should take that back. But you mentioned that they were asked if the project were to cost more, would they still be interested? So they said it probably not possibly yes. And then there was an off-ramp plan. Can you talk more about how that off-ramp plan is set up?
Yeah, so there were specific points in the project timeline for NuScale where they got, were offered a chance to exit the project without a penalty, or they could recommit, and also renegotiate the amount of power that they wanted from the project. We think that off-ramps are really important in any project because communities are, or any customer, it can be scared to commit to something if they know they're gonna be locked in indefinitely, whether it's nuclear waste siting or, a new power plant project. So the fact that NuScale built these off-ramps in, where there's specific points where they say, we're gonna come back to you and ask, do you still wanna be part of this project? And you can say no, and there's no lawsuit, there's no penalty. That really helps bring more communities in from at the beginning and stay with it. So, we can leave, we have like 3 more checkpoints where we can leave if it doesn't make sense for us. And the reason, saying they're not sensitive to cost, the issue is that it was still the cheapest thing for them because they were looking for something that met their demand that was 0 carbon. And so for that region of the country, that was still the best option for them.
In addition to the increasing energy demands that will come with larger working age populations, there's a lot of negative pressure now on countries about energy dependency since the Ukraine war has started. Have you folks tried to factor that into your calculus in some way and target specific potential customers that are right now otherwise quite dependent on Russian oil supplies or oil supply from politically
So
questionable
we
places?
haven't specifically, but there is a lot that US government, US industry has done, particularly with Eastern European countries, to get off natural gas. And so briefly, personal story, my husband is Swedish. I spend every summer 3 months in Sweden, and they're just seeing in the last 2 years, the conversation shift on nuclear. Sweden had a plan to phase out nuclear by 2010, they didn't. And now they're talking about building new nuclear, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine really changed the conversation in a lot of Europe. From, well, maybe we need to keep these plants open and not shut them down, to, well, we're probably gonna need new nuclear. And so it's been really interesting. Unfortunately, a lot of that conversation has been led by the far right in a lot of countries. And so that's it's a weird, what's the word, Baptists and bootleggers, the climate change, the Green Party and the far right are agreeing on some policies. Everyone wants to get off Russian gas. So the politics around nuclear has really changed fast in Europe. And so for what the US government's been doing and what industry's been doing is a lot of engagement in Poland and Romania, NuScale, but also a lot of money towards feasibility studies, workforce development. Okay, are there students? Okay, we should prioritize. Okay.
Thank you. So my name is Rajman. I'm a student and actually I'm from Indonesia. So we know that Indonesia just signed a new grant agreement between USDA and also Indonesia, right? And my question is, the proposed SMR will be in West Borneo, if I'm not mistaken. As we know, at the same time, Indonesia is making new capital city in Borneo as well. So why did you consider about why it should be in West Borneo? As we know, I think there are big borders of Indonesia, like, they are afraid of nuclear because they are in ring of fire and so many earthquakes there. So how would you ensure that it should be safe for Indonesia?
Yeah, there's nothing I could do. I think the regulator in Indonesia will need to really kick the tires and prove the case in a way that gains trust from the citizens. And so that's not guaranteed. I think we do have a lot of experience operating nuclear plants in high seismic areas like Japan, California. And then in particular, I'm trying to remember, I've heard different nuclear companies talking with Indonesia, so I'm not sure which then it is, but a lot of the advanced reactors can be more resistant and have, better safety case if they're working at ambient pressures and passive safety features. So that I'm confident that it can be done, but it has to be proven to the people in a way that there's, trust and transparency. And so that's not guaranteed. Even if I think, these future reactors are completely safe and I would trust, living with one in an earthquake zone, there needs to be trust in the regulator locally.
I think because in terms of new scale, I think like technical assistance for this establishment. So in terms of the technical aspect, what it is, I think why it should be in US.
I don't know.
Okay. So is it like from new scale or from Indonesia Power? From electricity in terms of the scale? Sorry, in terms of the location.
I don't know.
So because I think another concern that we should think about the lack of knowledge of nuclear understanding. I think because Indonesia lack of Indonesian power, Indonesian people like understand well about nuclear. And yeah, the thing is only just a basic research. We have council there, but yeah, we are still struggling to how we could convince that nuclear is safe and nuclear could be implemented in everywhere in Indonesia.
That's a good question. I think education is also a challenge in the US around. I mean, even though we have nuclear, a lot of people don't know. I give talks at places and I ask people how much of US electricity comes from nuclear, and there's a lot of places where people think, none, we don't have any. So not a foregone conclusion, we do have a lot more nuclear engineers, so that's a big difference. And so you do see in that map, some of these countries, while they don't have nuclear power, have huge nuclear engineering programs, or at least the diaspora that's coming back. So like Nigeria has a ton of folks going to get nuclear engineering degrees in other countries and in Nigeria. So that's probably a good place to start, is developing the workforce either domestically or sending people. That's a big thing that Russia does in terms of nuclear diplomacy, is they fund a ton of PhD students to come to Russia and study nuclear engineering, particularly in Africa or from African countries. And so the US doesn't have that same capability to do it directly, but the universities in the US do have great nuclear engineering programs, and they draw a lot of students organically, but there's not that same, direct investment you can do with a state-owned utility, state-owned nuclear industry, for better or worse.
I'm curious about Good Energy's approach to community engagement. I guess, what does that practically look like?
Yeah, so a big thing that was important to our founding is an acceptance that community engagement was done really poorly with a lot of the original nuclear power plants in the US. There was this, it wasn't an intentional framework, but a framework that we've come to call decide, announce, defend. So the utility would decide where the power plant was going to go based on demand for electricity, based on where they could buy cheap land, where they could get water rights, and they'd say, we're going to build a nuclear power plant here. They'd announce it, and then they'd defend against lawsuits with lawyers. This did get a lot of nuclear power plants built pretty quickly, but a lot of opposition also grew with this. So now we do know that people who live near nuclear power plants are very supportive, but it doesn't mean the model was a success. It meant that, you know, these people were sort of forced to accept the plants, and then also a lot of them work at the plants or know people that work at the plants, and they've had a good experience with, you know, 4 decades of the nuclear power plant, but it wasn't a good model for getting something cited. So what we're looking at is changing the paradigm of how you site nuclear power plants to find communities that are interested, that want a nuclear power plant, that you think would want one. Maybe it has a coal plant closing, maybe it has experience with nuclear, it's near a national lab, it's near, you know, weapons facility, and then have the vendor or a state regulator engage with them around, okay, what would you want a project to look like? What sorts of benefits? Would you want something that's in a lot more policies, a lot more like DOE grants and loan program office is you have to include a community benefits agreement to get money from the government to these projects. And that's something that's new. And it may seem really obvious that you'd want to provide benefits to the community that was hosting the plant, but in the past, it was just kind of assumed like, well, we're gonna build something here, so jobs and economic activity, and we'll love it. But looking more intentionally at what does the community want, and so a lot of the times it can be something like, we want improvements to our roads, which you're gonna be using to do this construction, so we might as well get, you know, safety improvements. Something that a lot of operating nuclear power plants offer, that's a concern, I won't go into it, but, is, investments and upgrades to the emergency management system, so emergency alert system for earthquakes, tsunamis, things like that. They have to be upgraded if you're hosting a nuclear power plant, but it also has a lot of secondary benefits for like wildfires or floods. You can help manage any sort of natural disaster. And so communities like that, investments in STEM programs in schools, investments in community colleges, those sorts of agreements. I think nuclear vendors are getting a lot smarter at listening to communities, figuring out what they want and building that into the agreements. Yeah.
One more question?
Okay.
In your answer, you slipped in something that sounds like a real nugget of something interesting. What's the connection between a community's acceptance of nuclear and their relationship, their proximity to weapons plants?
What's the relation? Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, so there's another nonprofit called Energy Communities Alliance, and they represent communities that have Department of Energy facilities, so a lot of the former weapons complex like Hanford. A lot of those communities, you might be surprised, are interested in nuclear power because they have a lot of experience with nuclear materials. They have a workforce that's very familiar with managing radiation. They might have a lot of negative experiences with contamination and cleanup, but they also have a lot more familiarity. And they know that, well, nuclear power plant is very heavily regulated. It's not like the weapons complex. And so we'd be very, we understand where the risks are, and a nuclear power plant doesn't have those types of risks, but we also have a workforce that is really knowledgeable. So looking towards the future, long term, rather than thinking about we're a town that's just focused on cleanup of this mess, we're looking towards future industries and bringing new jobs. And it's a way to kind of keep, a lot of these communities are looking for ways to keep their young people in the town. And so bringing in a new industry that's like exciting and clean energy, that's very attractive. Even in places where you think might have a negative relationship to things nuclear, if you're a town that's kind of your identity is very focused on waste and cleanup, having something, you know, a positive industry is really appealing.
I just find that fascinating because I own a house a few miles from Rocky Flats. There's no way anybody would be excited about nuclear.
Well, there's a lot of interest in coal repowering in Colorado, so, yeah.
That's it. Thanks.
I think we're at time. This has been a wonderful, wonderful presentation, so let's all thank Jessica.
Yeah, and then, they open it up for recreation.